Hello, everyone, to another video session of the Colloquium European Societies in the Digital Age. The topic today is fear. This is all fear-driven, is the subject. And our guest is Professor Fernando Vallespin. A warm welcome to you. He is speaking from Madrid, where we have good weather. I heard that already. And we are sitting now here at the Gustav Stresemann Institute in Bonn, where it's a bit rainy. And we will start talking on how Europe is impressed by fear subjects. And Fernando, would you first, in short, present yourself in a few words so everyone who is listening now and later knows who you are?
Well, I'm a political science professor at the Autónoma University in Madrid. My field of specialty is political theory, really, and particularly contemporary political theory would be my main subject. So I'm quite interested in what's going on, you know. So
Fernando, we met at a conference in Marseille last year on European citizenship, and you have been holding the keynote called, I have it noted, Getting Emotions and Politics Right. Do we need a new emotional deal? And I think you're the real person to talk with us about that, because at our convention last year, we had several panels on migration, on Heimat, on populism, on hate speech, and on different points of the different discussions, it popped up that this is all fear-driven. Many things of this are fear-driven, so we thought it would be interesting to have a session on this subject. So, Fernando, I would ask you, maybe you can tell us what you mean by a new emotional deal, and can we get emotions and politics right?
Yeah, well, I think the question that lies beyond that question is really that we have passed from a highly technocratized politics, particularly within the European Union, but also within most of the nation states in Europe. So politics has become very technical. We have shifted towards a politics that's far more passionate, so to say. It's more emotional, emotion-driven, right? And we know that there's not a real way. There's not a right way to put together reason and passion, but in a certain sense, we know that we have to balance them, right? So not everything's based exclusively on a rational perspective, but neither is everything driven by passionates themselves, right? And I think, well, you pointed to that before. You know that one of the main features of this new populist moment in Europe is precisely that passions have become again, you know, one of the means through which politics is being practiced. So we used to be accustomed to a politics that were not so much emotionally driven, but more reasonable, more through arguments, more through deliberation. And now what we feel, and I think, well, this can be another point to discuss. You know, perhaps because of this explosion of communication through social media, passions now have found a marvelous means through which they're being communicated and through which they can be enticed.
And so what do you think, Fernando, what role plays fear in the set of emotions you have been working on?
Yeah.
Because you said passion is something positive should be something
Yeah, well, passion
positive.
is more or less a synonym of the affects or the emotions, right? So we may use them interchangeably, right? So no, but the first thing I'd like to say is that fear is perhaps one of the most natural human emotions. So if we look at ourselves, we are always fearful of something. It's simply because it's a way to protect us, to fear things. And I think so in this way it's a defense mechanism that we have, not just as individuals but also as societies. So I wouldn't say that fear in itself it's a bad thing to feel, right? But when it turns out to be one of the key passions, so when people are more fearful than hopeful, then I think it's when we start having a problem. And I think that's precisely what's happening among us in Europe overall, that we are fearful, and we're fearful particularly in face of the future. So we fear the future. So we used to believe that everything would be much better in the future. That's the main idea that underlines the concept of progress, that somehow European societies since the Enlightenment have been constantly, on the way of progressing towards better societies. And now what we fear is that this will stop. And probably we will have a much tougher competition in economic terms with Asia, particularly China, especially, that we may not be capable of maintaining our welfare states, so our welfare society. We're fearful that we may lose our democratic systems. And so these are common fears that I would consider to be, in a certain sense, healthy, because they will probably have the effect of forcing us to do something in order to avoid losing our welfare states, losing our liberal societies. But on the other hand, I would say there's also a more sickening perception of fear when fear is projected towards minorities, for instance, towards migrants, right?
Okay.
So, and this is so in some parties, instead of alleviating the fears of the people, what they're doing is they are enhancing certain fears, particularly regarding refugees, regarding people coming from other societies. So the fear of losing the main characters of our society is natural, but I think when it starts being sickening, it's when we convert it into somehow an obsession, right? And I think that's what we find, the praxis of most of the populist parties, right? Targeting precisely that emotion among people.
Yeah.
So there's something that we have to fear, and that we have to fear that we're losing the societies we've been educated on, we've been grown in, and we are facing another society where foreigners, strangers are going to pick up our jobs and are probably provoking, a societal crisis in terms of identity, of collective identity. And in that sense, I think this kind of fear promotion is, well, I can think of a better adjective, but I think it's sickening, right?
Yeah, that's interesting, Fernando, because many things you were speaking of connect to topics we already had in the colloquium. For example, you have been saying that fear is a defense system, and we basically have fear for the future. And Vassilis Sophiadélis, to whom we will be talking tomorrow on fear, who has been before also on the convention, he he works on. He's a social entrepreneur, and he works on with refugees and migrants on Lesbos in Greece.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him to give some statements so we can just include it already today with you. And he said. It's fear for change. I think that's interesting. You said it's fear for future, and he says it's fear for change, and that is maybe this what is underlying under all those things. And you also said address the welfare systems or the fear that they don't work. And in our session with Ulrike Giraud and Vincent Engel, we have been talking on visions, and I asked them what would your vision be of a good Europe? What could be a good narrative for Europe? And they said Europe based on solidarity and on justice, where everyone can be part of a welfare system. So I think that fear is something that lies between this. So what do you think is the role of how does that work? Because that's maybe what you are working on in politics. You have a fear, and then people who instrumentalize the fear for that was also what you have been saying. So it's misused for something else. And how does that work?
Yeah, okay. There's something that I think is quite interesting, which is to observe that what we really fear is not so much change, but what we fear is to lose things that we have already given for granted, like having a pension, like being used to having a magnificent sanitary system that's being publicly financed, or educational system. So if we are less competitive than we used to be, we may lose, the kind of life that we've been leading. So in a certain sense, what we fear is not change, but what we fear is, change to the bottom, so to say. I mean, not change in order to get a better society, but, that the society turns to be worse than the society that we are familiarized with, right? So in that sense, look at the main problems that lie ahead of us, as societies in the world right now. There's climate change. We're all fearful of climate change because we don't know how to handle it. We know we lack the necessary means in order to create global governance in order to avoid the worst repercussions of climate change. But look also at technological change and what it implies for employment, for instance. We don't know if we'll be, in the near future, if we'll have a job, that makes sense, because our jobs might be, stolen by artificial intelligence or robots, or who knows, right? So in that sense, this triggers fear, and I think it's extremely logical that we feel that kind of fear, right? So that because somehow we as Europeans, I'm talking now, we as Europeans, we have a lot to lose, right? So we live in the most developed societies, in societies that are even now are still quite cohesive, with a large per capita income, with an enormous amount of public services. And well, we all know how difficult it is to finance all these privileges, right? So we may lose that. And I think this fear is absolutely justified. What I think...
Fernando, you have... you have been saying it's also fear for technological change.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, from your perspective, what role does digitalization or globalization play, or is digital space resonating fear?
Yeah.
So
Well.
it's two topics. The one is a
Yeah.
fear
Yeah.
for technological change that may lead to losing your job, and the other is do we have a digital space where fear can be resonated by people who are interested in resonating and enhancing fear?
Yeah, but look, technology is one of the key points in the this discussion. But technology not just affecting through robotization or through artificial intelligence, not just affecting employment.
Mm.
Look at all the moral issues that stem from what we may call, the manipulation of human DNA, right?
Mm.
So in front of us, there are lots of problems for which we haven't really an answer yet. In this latter case, we don't have an answer as to how to face a large part of those issues that have a moral dimension, that are
Mm.
associated with the possibility of finding ourselves within societies where those that can afford it can endow their children, with certain benefits,
Mm.
biological benefits, simply because of the manipulation of the human genome, right?
Mm.
So that's also a fear, because we know that technologies will radically alter, the rules under which we play in our social life, and we know that we don't have enough, and I think this is what speaks in favor of Europe. We don't have enough size, no matter how large as a country like Germany, for instance, the
Mhm.
most populated country in the European Union, that was still too small, to be capable of leading with these kind of problems,
Mm.
with minimal capacity to solve them, right? So that
Yeah.
we need to gain size
Yeah.
somehow, and that most of the
That's
problems, like climate change, technological
yeah.
advances, moral issues, in
Mm.
order to solve them, we need cooperation, and we need to cooperate first at the European level, and that through global governance, of course.
Fernando, that's interesting because that leads to you have been saying we don't have the size to cope with those transnational problems like climate change and so
Hmm. Hmm.
so that leads me to the question: how does it work that nationalism is the result of the fear for not being able to cope with the changes that will come, but as you said, what we would need is not being smaller in terms of being national, but we need to have more size, to be more people to be able to cope with this. So, uh, what do you think of the connection between fear and nationalism?
Yeah, but I think it touches upon two dimensions which are different. I think the first dimension, which I think it's a key dimension, is the fear that has been triggered by migrations, right?
Mm.
So people seem to find a solution to that, getting back to the good old frontiers, good old borders, right? So that's what Trump wants to do, to build a wall. That's what we have seen after the refugee crisis, building a wall all through, through the southeastern part of Europe,
Mm.
which has indeed been already built. So, and this touches, upon this kind of fear that I said wasn't so positive in a way, or so moral. But the other kind of fears are fears that have to do with, the need for someone whom you can trust to protect you, right?
Mm.
And so it's easier for an ordinary German or an ordinary Spaniard to
Mm.
think that the German state or the Spanish state will protect him or her than something, as abstract as Brussels, right?
Mm.
So people, feel closer to the national societies in the sense that they believe that the national politicians will satisfy the interests of the national first, right?
Mm.
So that's America first, gain back control. That was this
Mm.
idea that
Yeah.
lies beyond
Also, the
Brexit.
Brexit was our
And so La France d'abord.
La France. Oh, oui, oui.
So everywhere you find the same discourse, and I think it makes sense to people because people are being used to the idea that it's your government that protects you. It's not a foreign government or a government that's been has been created through pan-European cooperation that protects you. So to people, that's too alien or it's too far away. So in that sense, I think that we need to make we need to explain people, the reasons that lie behind this situation that I consider to be false, which is the idea that the nation state can protect us. So we have to explain people that it's just a country, that it's just through cooperation between nation state that we can all be saved. That there's no such thing as a single state solution to most of our problems. And here again, I mean, I think ecological questions are the main questions. I think everyone understands them. But we also have to realize that we also need cooperation in terms of planning designing competitive technological issues or technological products that can allow us to face what I consider to be a crucial moment within the development of the productive systems, right? So in the world, and in that sense, I think Europe is losing ground vis-a-vis China or the United States. So in that sense, we also need to cooperate on that, and it's very important for politicians to say, okay, we all know it's much easier to say, trust me because I'm German, but they should start saying, trust me because I will try to bring Germany in with other countries in order to gain, more force, to gain more strength, and to be capable together to solve the problems that we have. And I think that would certainly alleviate fears.
So, Fernando, do you think that do you recognize an increasing of insecureness that leads to more need to be protected, and so more being focused on the national promise, protection promise, if you want. Does that have changed? Is it connected? Is it linked to globalization, or is it just what happens?
Well, it is linked to globalization. It's linked to technological change. It's linked to migrations. But look, if you look at the populist discourse, what you immediately find out is that's based on lies. The main lie is that migrants are a threat. Take the case of Hungary or other East European countries. Okay, well, first it's false. So they don't have a migrant problem because they hardly have any migrants. And second,
but they have the fear.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The problem is not immigrants. The problem is their own nationals emigrating, right? So there are more than 1 million Poles that live outside of Poland, right? So you have a huge amount, increasingly, of Bulgarians, of Hungarians, of maybe with the exception of the Czech Republic, everyone's, all the highly qualified people are leaving the country because they're much better off in other countries, right? So why focusing on immigration? Why don't you focus on emigration?
Yeah.
And try to solve what's really your problem. So your problem is not an Islamic minority, that's increasing in Hungary.
Mm.
Your problem is, those better educated Hungarians who want to leave the country because they don't find enough opportunities within a country called Hungary. And that's so in that sense, we need politicians to, to look at the problems, with a sense of fairness, not with, in order to cheat, or in order to create false fears. And I think that's,
Mm.
they are specialized on that. So, and I think we need to be capable of countering, this tendency,
Counter room.
to put the blame constantly on someone.
But Fernando, what do you think? Who is interested in increasing fears and why?
Well, I think it's very profitable in terms of votes, right? So I think it's if you know that there's an important part of a population that's fearful, you offer yourself as being the only one to be capable of
Mm.
solving the problems,
Mm.
that you link with your fears. For instance, stopping immigration. If you
Mm.
think that migrants, migrants are criminals, that migrants take away your jobs, or that
Mm.
migrants bring in, the possibility of lower salaries and things like
Mm.
that, and I think we have to confront those discourses with reality. I think we people ought to know, what that there are certain problems that might increase our fear, but if we don't face them, we will never solve them.
Mm.
What's absolutely irresponsible is to believe that by finding a scapegoat, you can really
Mm.
solve those problems.
Yeah.
You may
You
have
can you can win elections, but not solving the problems.
exactly. That's what people will need to start, changing, the way they think about politics. And here we have the problem of the social media.
Yeah.
Because the social media generally, you can't make arguments, you can't really deliberate, you can't really, have a rational conversations. So it's very emotional, it's very expressive, right? So
Um,
these guys are great or these guys are the devil, right? So there's no in between, and most of the problems are really tough to see, tough to define, and there
yeah.
are no easy solutions, and we have to debate them. So we cannot simply solve them by saying, so these minorities responsible for what happens, or this other country
Mm.
is responsible for what happens. I think this is really what's going on right nowadays in our strange public sphere, because as you know, we have this dual or schizophrenic public sphere. On the one hand, the traditional media, on the
Mm.
other hand, the social media, and sometimes they don't really fit, together. And that's
That's the point of maybe digital space resonating and fostering those
exactly, yeah.
uh, unclear, fear-enhancing, emotional
Hmm.
conversations. Yeah.
There's also one point which I think it's interesting to think about and to understand, and that we will have to solve, is the introduction through the digital space of new forms
Mm.
of power and of control
Mm.
that have the possibility through bots and other devices
Mm.
being used in the net to encourage certain emotions, right? So
Yeah.
to feed particularly negative emotions,
Yeah.
right?
Feed
So it's not.
fear.
They don't generally make people hopeful, but they make people fearful, I would say, right? And so, who controls them? Some people say, well, it's Russian hackers. I think this is a
Mm.
simplification. So in the digital space, we know that there are certain powers operating which are uncontrolled. That that are unaccountable to us. Right? So we can make our institutions accountable, but we don't know how to make accountable all these other actors in this new digital spaces that are so much conditioning our public discourse.
Yeah, they are using it very well. The people.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
To strengthen fears.
Yeah.
So Fernando, that is a really an interesting point. All points connected that underlie under a lot of things. And I have a last question to you. How do you think that this fear will express itself at the European elections?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think we have a problem in these elections because I think there's a lot at stake. And, after Brexit, particularly, but also, after the Euro crisis, after the refugee crisis, I think Europe has been divided into several blocks, that we need to bring in together, and we that need to cohere. And on the other hand, we have another problem that doesn't have so much to do with what we may call internal enemies of Europe. So enemies of Europe that live within Europe, like the populists, for instance. But, foreign enemies of Europe that are trying to avoid that Europe has gained strength, at the international scene. And I would, I think that the world has turned increasingly different to what Europe represents. So there are lesser liberal democracies. There are more, more authoritarian regimes going on right now in the world. There's a certain crisis of democracy outside of others of European spaces. So in a certain sense, Europe has, has become slowly one of the very few open societies that remains. And, my fear, so now I'm talking about fears, my fear is that we may also fall sooner or later, right? That if we don't have the chance of enhancing the European project, that we won't have the defenses needed in order to cope with these new forces, at the international level, that are so alien to what we represent. So we're still, a Kantian, so to say, a Kantian world, right? But the world outside our borders, it's a Hobbesian world. And in that sense, I think it's difficult, to survive being a Kantian at a Hobbesian world.
Okay, so that was the last question, but now really last, because you said Europe is one of the last open societies. So do you think that is something, because I don't want to close so dystopian. What do we have to foster to have conditions that we can defend and let grow the open society, the European open societies?
Yeah, you see, what has changed, to my mind, I think maybe I may be wrong, is that some years ago, Europe was quite self-assured. So we never perceived that we would lose, what we had already gained. And in that sense, we could allow ourselves to be very present, all over the world, right? Nowadays, we're facing, first, because of Trump, that we don't have the military protection of the United States anymore, right? So let's see how, this troubled waters, surrounding NATO will be pacified. So we need to have a stronger defense and foreign policy, because we need to protect ourselves, because we're not being protected anymore,
The promise of protection.
Exactly. And so in that sense, I think that we will have a lot of incentives to look more to ourselves and less to the world. So in that sense, we'll fortify ourselves, as a separate territory, a separate polity, and we will lose what I have thought was one of the marvels of European Union, which was this cosmopolitan, a projection that we had all over the world, right? And so in that sense, we will become, a mega state, maybe, or, a sum total of states, that has decided to, and I think we have no other. I mean, there's no other way to do it. That will have to decide first to solve these immediate problems like defense or joint foreign policy, and then in the second, then would come the need to solve a second bunch of problems, such as protecting democratic institutions, liberal values, toleration, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the idea would be that we could be capable of doing everything together, right? But I think first things come first. And in that case, I think most of European countries are now feeling that, foreign enemies, so to say, are at our gates. Now we have the Crimea crisis, we have the problem, the Baltic, with the certain aggressiveness of Russian army. We have, Russian hackers, we have Trump, looking outside of, towards the Pacific, trying not to cooperate with Europe in economic terms, just on the contrary, trying to put barriers to commerce and things like that. So we are full of enemies, I would say, and in a broad sense.
Yeah.
If you feel this menace, if you feel this threat, well, the logical thing to do is, okay, let's stick together, but to protect us. And I think the European project was based on the presumption that it's not just protection that we need from each other, it's also projection, towards the world. This cosmopolitan ideal of the Enlightenment, right? And I hope that we don't lose that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Fernando. That was really good. Now, you said first things first, and now let's make first a cosmopolitan, open European society. That is maybe the first thing we have to do, so we can protect everyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, we'll try to do this. Thanks a lot for your contribution, and have a good day in Madrid.
You too.
Yes. Okay.
Bon.
Thanks. Wait.